In the winter of 1709, the coldest winter Europe had seen in 500 years descended on France without warning. Rivers froze solid enough to walk across. Wine froze inside sealed barrels in Paris cellars, and the ice split the wooden staves apart. Out in the vineyards of the Charente region along the Atlantic coast near a small port town called Cognac, entire rows of grapevines died down to the root in a single week. Historians estimate that roughly 600,000 people died across France that winter, and the famine that followed it, more than the total military casualties France would suffer in some of its wars. The frost did not just kill people, it gutted an industry that the entire region depended on, an industry built not on wine itself, but on something distilled from it. Contemporary accounts describe seawater freezing along parts of the French coast, bread freezing solid in bakers' ovens, and travelers found frozen to death on the roads between towns. King Louis XIV's own court at Versailles reportedly struggled to stay warm despite roaring fires in nearly every room. This was not an isolated cold snap. It was a continent-wide catastrophe, and the vineyards of western France sat directly in its path. Because by 1709, the vineyards of Charente were not really in the wine business anymore. They were in the brandy business. For nearly a century, Dutch traders had been sailing up the Charente River, buying up the region's thin, acidic white wine, and boiling it down into a concentrated spirit to make it cheaper to ship and harder to tax. That spirit had a name: Brandewijn, burnt wine. And somewhere between the boiling kettle and the wooden barrel it aged in, something strange happened. A product invented purely to dodge shipping costs and customs duties, a product nobody originally intended to drink on its own, quietly became one of the most prized luxury goods on Earth. Today, you can buy a bottle of decent brandy for less than $20 at almost any liquor store in the world. And yet a single bottle of the rarest cognac ever sold, a 1947 Cognac Grande Champagne, went for more than $160,000 at auction. Think about that for a second. Same base product, wine, distilled. One version cost less than a movie ticket. The other costs more than most people's cars. So how did a tax dodge invented by Dutch merchants become one of the most sophisticated luxury industries on the planet? How did burnt wine become the drink of kings, gangsters, and billionaires? And how did a plant disease that nobody in France saw coming nearly wipe the entire thing off the map? That was 1709. But the story of brandy does not begin in France, and it does not begin with wine merchants at all. It begins more than 1,000 years earlier, in the laboratories of the Islamic Golden Age, with scholars who were not trying to make anything you would want to drink. The technique at the heart of brandy: distillation. The process of heating a liquid until part of it turns to vapor, and then cooling that vapor back into a purer, more concentrated liquid, was not invented for alcohol at all. The earliest evidence of distillation apparatus comes from Mesopotamia, roughly 2,000 years before the Common Era, where it was used to extract perfumes and aromatic oils from plants. But the version of distillation that would eventually give the world brandy came out of the great scientific centers of the Islamic world in the 8th and 9th centuries. A chemist and polymath named Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin texts as Geber, refined distillation apparatus and techniques so thoroughly that later European scholars would treat his work as the foundation of the entire field. The word alcohol itself comes from the Arabic al-kul, which originally referred to a fine powder used as eyeliner and only later came to describe the pure, refined essence of a distilled liquid. Jabir was not brewing spirits for a party. He was doing what alchemists across the Islamic world spent centuries doing, trying to isolate the essential nature of substances, chasing purity for its own sake. He did not know he was laying the groundwork for a French luxury export. He was doing it anyway. Distillation apparatus in the 9th and 10th centuries was crude by modern standards. Glass or ceramic vessels, narrow tubes, careful control of heat over open flame. But the underlying principle was sound, and it worked. No refining, no shortcuts, just patient application of heat and cold, repeated over and over until a liquid gave up its purest self. The scholars doing this work were not thinking about wine specifically. They were interested in essential oils, in acids, in the theoretical building blocks of matter itself. Alcohol, in the sense of a distilled spirit strong enough to burn, was closer to a byproduct of their broader chemical curiosity than a deliberate invention. The knowledge traveled, as knowledge from the Islamic Golden Age so often did, through Moorish Spain and through the great translation centers of medieval Europe, where Arabic scientific texts were rendered into Latin and studied by monks, physicians, and scholars hungry for anything that looked like real science. By the 12th century, distillation had reached the medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, one of the most important centers of medicine in medieval Europe. There, physicians began distilling wine itself, and what came out the other end astonished them. A colorless, intensely flammable liquid that burned with almost no smoke. They called it aqua ardens, burning water. Later scholars, including the Catalan physician and alchemist Arnaldus de Villanova and the philosopher Ramon Llull, gave it a grander name that would echo through the history of spirits for the next 800 years. Aqua Vitae, the water of life. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains so much of what comes later. Nearly every European language that developed its own tradition of grape or grain spirit ended up naming that spirit some local variation of exactly the same phrase. Aquavit in Scandinavia, eau de vie in France, ushka baha in Ireland, which English speakers eventually mangled into the word whiskey. Water of life translated and retranslated across a continent by cultures that had almost no direct contact with one another, all converging on the same idea. That this strange burning liquid was not just a curiosity, it was something closer to medicine, closer to magic, closer to the divine. Now, medieval physicians were not thinking about cocktail hour. They believed with total sincerity that they had discovered something close to a medical miracle. Distilled spirit was used as an antiseptic, a painkiller, and a treatment for nearly every ailment imaginable, from stomach complaints to the plague itself. Monasteries across Europe began distilling their own wine into spirit, partly for medicine, and partly, if we are honest, because monks were some of the only people in medieval Europe with the literacy, the equipment, and the patience to run a proper still. This was not about getting drunk. This was about medicine, alchemy, and the pursuit of something people genuinely believed could extend life. That belief would take centuries to fade, and in some corners of Europe, it never fully did. This is where the story takes a turn nobody in a medieval monastery could have predicted, because the same liquid that monks were prescribing as medicine was about to become one of the most important commodities in transatlantic trade. And the people who made that happen were not doctors. They were merchants, and they were trying to solve a much more boring problem: shipping costs. By the late 1500s and into the 1500s and 1600s, the Dutch had built the most sophisticated maritime trading network in Europe. Dutch ships moved salt, grain, textiles, and wine across the continent, and among the wine regions they depended on most heavily was the area around the town of Cognac in the Charente region of western France. The problem was that Charente wine was not particularly good. The soil there, chalky and thin, produced a wine that was highly acidic and did not travel well. On long sea voyages, it often spoiled entirely. On top of that, wine was heavy, bulky, and expensive to transport in bulk, and French taxes on wine exports were steep. So the Dutch did what merchants have always done when a product is too heavy, too fragile, and too taxed to move profitably. They shrank it. Dutch traders began buying up Charente wine and boiling it down in copper stills, driving off most of the water and leaving behind a concentrated, high-proof spirit that took up a fraction of the space and weight of the original wine, and crucially, was taxed as a different category of good altogether. They called it Brandewijn, from the Dutch words for burnt and wine, and the plan was simple. Ship the concentrated spirit back to Holland, add water back to it, and sell it as reconstituted wine at a fraction of the shipping cost. It was not romance. It was not craftsmanship. It was a customs and logistics hack.
Here is the detail that makes this whole story strange.
Somewhere along the way, either through simple neglect, through the long delays of sea voyages, or through merchants discovering that the concentrated spirit sold perfectly well on its own without ever being watered back down, people stopped adding the water back. They started drinking the Brandewijn itself. And the version that had spent months, sometimes years, sitting in wooden casks in a ship's hold or in a warehouse waiting to be sold, tasted different from the version fresh off the still. Better, rounder, warmer. Nobody set out to invent barrel aging. Nobody in the 1600s ran a controlled experiment on oak tannins and oxidation. A tax dodge sat in wooden barrels for lack of a buyer, and by pure accident, it turned into something extraordinary.
Now, that particular origin story, the idea that barrel aging was discovered entirely by accident through unsold, forgotten casks, is impossible to pin down to a single moment or a single merchant, and historians treat it as a plausible reconstruction rather than a documented fact. But the broader pattern, that Dutch demand for a shippable, tax-efficient wine concentrate is what created the brandy industry in the first place, and that extended time in oak barrels is what transformed a rough spirit into something worth drinking on its own, is well supported by trade records and by the simple chemistry of what oak aging actually does to a spirit. This decision, driven entirely by tax law and shipping economics, seemed like a small administrative workaround at the time. It was not. It created an entire category of luxury good. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. Stories about the strange, accidental, and often greedy origins of the things sitting in your kitchen and your liquor cabinet. And you will not want to miss what comes next, because the story of brandy is about to get a lot darker before it gets rich. Word of this new spirit spread across Europe, and different regions began putting their own stamp on it, using local wine and local techniques. But it was the Charente region, and specifically the area around the town of Cognac, that would come to dominate the category so completely that its name eventually became shorthand for the entire premium end of the industry. What made Cognac different was not just location. It was a set of rules developed over generations that turned an accidental byproduct into a deliberate craft. The wine of Charente, thin and acidic, was actually perfect for distillation, because the qualities that made it a bad drinking wine, low sugar, high acidity, made for a cleaner, purer distillate once it went through the still. Producers in the region began distilling their wine not once, but twice, a process called double distillation, using a specific type of copper pot still known as the alembic charente. The first distillation produced a rough, low-proof liquid called the brûlé. The second distillation, splitting the output into a discarded head, a usable heart, and a discarded tail, concentrated that liquid into a clear, potent spirit called eau de vie, the water of life, echoing that same medieval Latin term the monks had used centuries earlier. Then came the barrels, and this is where a second regional accident of geography changed everything. The forests around Limousin and Trancé, not far from Cognac, produced oak with a particular grain structure, tight enough to age spirits slowly without excessive evaporation, porous enough to let a small amount of air interact with the liquid over years, sometimes decades. Producers began aging their eau de vie in barrels made from this local oak, and the spirit that came out the other end had transformed almost entirely. Harsh, clear alcohol turned into something amber, soft, layered with notes of vanilla, dried fruit, and spice, drawn slowly out of the wood itself. Nobody understood the chemistry, the way oak lignins break down into vanillin, the way slow oxidation through the wood mellows sharp alcohol compounds into something rounder. They just understood that the longer it sat, the better it got. Patience, trial, and repetition, not laboratory science, built the foundations of modern cognac. Here is the uncomfortable part of this story that the industry does not love to advertise. Cognac's early reputation as an elite product was built almost entirely by foreign demand, specifically English and Dutch demand, at a time when English aristocrats were desperate for alternatives to French wine because of recurring wars and trade embargoes between England and France.
Brandy filled that gap. It traveled well, it did not spoil, and it delivered the same warming effect as wine in a fraction of the volume. English merchants and later Irish and Scottish families who settled in the Cognac region specifically to be closer to the trade built some of the great cognac houses that still exist today. Richard Hennessy, an Irish soldier who had served in the French army, founded his cognac house in the town of Cognac in 1765. Thomas Hine, an Englishman, founded his house a few decades later. This was not a purely French invention exported outward. It was, from very early on, an international business built by foreigners who saw an opportunity in a French farming region and never left. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles south of Cognac, a rival brandy tradition had actually been quietly distilling wine for even longer, and its story rarely gets told with the same reverence. In the Armagnac region of Gascony in southwestern France, documented records of distilled wine spirit go back to at least the 14th century, arguably making Armagnac the older of France's two great brandy traditions by a wide margin. Armagnac producers historically used a different still design, a smaller, portable column still called the Alembic Armagnacis, capable of a single continuous pass rather than Cognac's careful double distillation, and the result was a rougher, more rustic, more intensely flavored spirit that never achieved the same international marketing machine that Cognac built for itself. Part of the reason comes down to something as unglamorous as geography and shipping routes. Cognac sat on a navigable river close to the Atlantic coast, easily accessible to Dutch and English merchant ships. Armagnac sat inland, harder to reach, harder to export in bulk. Two nearly identical products born from the same basic idea, separated mainly by which one happened to be closer to a port. One became a global luxury brand recognized in nightclubs from Tokyo to Atlanta. The other remained for centuries a beloved regional secret that most people outside of France have still never tasted. Proximity to a river, more than quality, decided which spirit would conquer the world. This is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn, because the same qualities that made brandy commercially valuable, its portability, its high alcohol content, and its long shelf life, made it a devastatingly effective tool of colonial exploitation. European traders carried brandy and other distilled spirits into West Africa as one of the core goods exchanged for enslaved human beings during the transatlantic slave trade. Alongside cloth, firearms, and metal goods, alcohol was a standard bargaining commodity on the West African coast for more than 2 centuries, and while rum from Caribbean sugar plantations became the dominant spirit in that specific triangle of trade, French and Dutch brandy played the same role along different stretches of coastline and in different colonial networks, particularly those tied to French trading posts. Ships holding barrels of brandy in their cargo, alongside chains and manacles, sailed the same routes, docked at the same ports, and were logged in the same trading company ledgers. Line items of cloth, iron, and spirit sitting directly above line items counting human beings as cargo. Brandy did not cause the slave trade. But brandy, like rum, like sugar, like tobacco, was woven directly into the machinery that moved millions of human beings across an ocean in chains. This was not incidental. European trading companies deliberately stocked spirits because demand for them among some coastal traders was consistent and reliable, which made it an efficient tool for negotiation. The historical record on exact volume specific to brandy versus other spirits is thinner than for rum, and historians are careful about that distinction, but the underlying pattern is not in dispute. Distilled spirits, brandy included, were currency in a system built on human suffering, and no amount of oak barrel romance changes that fact. This is the part of brandy's history that does not make it into the glossy tasting notes on the back of the bottle, and it should not. Back in Europe, brandy's other dark chapter unfolded more slowly, and it had nothing to do with slavery and everything to do with a nearly invisible insect. In the 1860s, a tiny yellow aphid called Phylloxera arrived in France, almost certainly imported accidentally on American vine cuttings that European botanists had brought over out of scientific curiosity.
Phylloxera feeds on the roots of grapevines, and European vine varieties, unlike their American cousins, had no evolved resistance to it whatsoever. The insect spread through French vineyards like a plague nobody could see coming and nobody could stop. By the 1870s and 1880s, Phylloxera had reached the Charente region, and it devastated the vineyards that supplied cognac production almost completely. Some estimates suggest that Phylloxera ultimately destroyed somewhere between 2/3 and nearly all of the vineyard acreage in the region over the following decades. Entire family farms that had grown grapes for cognac for generations went bankrupt. Production collapsed. Prices for the brandy that did exist skyrocketed, and counterfeit and adulterated brandies, some made from grain spirit or even industrial alcohol, flavored to imitate the real thing, flooded the market to fill the gap left behind, badly damaging the reputation of French brandy at exactly the moment it could least afford it. Farmers watched healthy vines yellow, wither, and die within a single growing season, with no visible cause above the soil, because the destruction was happening entirely underground. Invisible root systems being slowly eaten away by an insect smaller than a pinhead. Whole villages in Charente that had built their economy around vine cultivation for generations lost their primary source of income almost overnight. Vineyard land that had been worth a fortune became nearly worthless, and many small growers sold their land for a fraction of its former value or abandoned it outright, some immigrating to French colonies in North Africa or to the Americas in search of work that had nothing to do with wine. The clock was already ticking on an industry-wide collapse, and for years, nobody had an answer. The eventual solution came not from France, but from the very country that had accidentally caused the crisis in the first place: American rootstock. The same species of vine that Phylloxera had evolved alongside and developed resistance to could be grafted onto French vine varieties, giving the growing plant American disease resistance below the soil while still producing the same French grape varieties above it. It worked. Grafting European vines onto American rootstock became standard practice across nearly every wine and brandy region in France, and it remains standard practice today. Nearly the entire modern cognac industry, and much of the global wine industry along with it, grows on root systems that are technically American, grafted invisibly beneath French vines that look, taste, and are marketed as purely traditionally French. Most people sipping a glass of cognac today have no idea that the vine it came from would not exist without an American plant that nearly destroyed the entire French wine industry by accident. The recovery from Phylloxera coincided with and helped accelerate a wave of industrialization and standardization that turned brandy from a farmhouse product into a global commercial category. In 1830, an Irish inventor and former tax official named Aeneas Coffey patented an improved continuous still, a design that could distill spirit constantly rather than in individual batches, dramatically increasing output and consistency. The coffee still and improvements on it transformed spirit production across Europe, making large-scale, consistent brandy, whiskey, and gin production commercially viable in a way that traditional pot stills, brilliant as they were for flavor, simply could not match at volume. Around this same era, the great cognac houses, Hennessy, Martell, Remy Martin, and others, began developing the grading and labeling systems that still define the category today. Terms like VS, very special, VSOP, very superior old pale, and XO, extra old, were codified to signal minimum aging requirements to consumers who had no way of tasting a bottle before buying it. Hennessy in particular is widely credited with popularizing the VSOP designation in the late 19th century, initially to satisfy a request from the British royal family for a distinctly labeled higher quality style of cognac. Whether every detail of that specific royal request has been preserved with full accuracy is debated among cognac historians. But the broader shift toward formal grading systems in this period is extremely well documented, and it is the direct ancestor of the labels you see on every bottle of brandy sold today. Aeneas Coffey himself has a small irony baked into his own biography that the industry rarely mentions. Before he became famous for a still design that revolutionized commercial spirit production, he worked as an excise officer for the British government, essentially a tax collector responsible for cracking down on illegal distillers. The man whose invention helped make large-scale legal brandy and whiskey production commercially dominant spent years of his career on the opposite side of the till, chasing down the same kind of underground distillers whose ingenuity he would later help put out of business. By the 20th century, brandy had fully completed its transformation from Dutch tax workaround to global luxury symbol. Napoleon Bonaparte's name became permanently, if somewhat loosely, attached to the cognac trade after his death, with brands using his name and imagery to evoke imperial French grandeur. Even though the historical connection between Napoleon himself and specific cognac houses is largely a matter of later marketing rather than documented personal habit. Cognac became the drink of choice in speakeasies during American Prohibition, when smuggled French brandy carried an air of sophisticated rebellion that domestic bootleg liquor simply could not match. Prohibition-era rum runners and bootleggers moved cognac and other French spirits across the Canadian and Caribbean borders alongside whiskey and rum, and the sheer difficulty and risk involved in smuggling it only added to its cachet once it reached a speakeasy table. It became, decades later, deeply embedded in hip-hop culture in the United States, with artists name-checking specific cognac brands in lyrics throughout the 1990s and 2000s, single-handedly reshaping the American market for a spirit that had spent centuries marketed almost exclusively to old European aristocracy and wealthy American businessmen. A product born from Dutch tax law in the 1600s, embraced by British royalty in the 1800s, and reinvented by American hip-hop culture in the 1990s. Same liquid, three completely different audiences, 400 years apart, all reaching for the same bottle for entirely different reasons. Today, the global brandy market, Cognac, Armagnac, and the many other regional and international styles combined, is worth tens of billions of dollars annually. And France remains the dominant force in the premium end of that market, exporting the vast majority of cognac production to markets overseas rather than consuming it domestically. The United States is consistently one of the largest single markets for cognac by volume, and in recent decades, China became one of the fastest growing and most valuable export markets for high-end cognac, with demand there driven heavily by gifting culture and status signaling among a rapidly growing wealthy class. A single region, roughly the size of a mid-sized American county, Charente and Charente-Maritime combined, supplies a spirit consumed and prized on nearly every continent on Earth. It is worth pausing on just how narrow that supply chain actually is. Nearly all of the world's cognac, by legal definition, must come from grapes grown, distilled, and aged within that one specifically delimited region of Western France, a rule enforced under French appellation law roughly the same way champagne is legally restricted to sparkling wine from the Champagne region. Brandy made anywhere else in the world, Spain, the United States, South Africa, Armenia, Peru, can be excellent, and in some cases genuinely rivals cognac in quality. But none of it can legally use the word cognac on the label. That single word, tied to a patch of French farmland smaller than many American counties, is worth billions of dollars in brand value alone. But brandy is far more than just a drink poured neat into a snifter. And this next part tends to catch people off guard. Brandy has quietly infiltrated an enormous range of products that have nothing to do with sipping cognac after dinner. It is a foundational ingredient in classic French cooking, used to deglaze pans, flambe desserts, and build the base of sauces in professional kitchens worldwide. Prized specifically because most of the alcohol burns off during cooking, while the concentrated flavor compounds remain. It is a key component in traditional British Christmas cooking, soaked into fruit cakes and folded into brandy butter, a use so deeply embedded in British holiday tradition that many households buy brandy exclusively for December and never touch it the rest of the year. It shows up in perfumery, where aged brandy's complex aromatic compounds are occasionally used as a base note in high-end fragrance work. Brandy has also long served as the fortifying agent in a category of wine most people do not even realize is related to it at all.
Sherry, port, and Madeira are all fortified wines, meaning a grape spirit, essentially an unaged brandy, is added to the wine during or after fermentation, both to boost the alcohol content and to stop fermentation at a chosen level of sweetness. This was originally, like so much of the story, a practical solution to a shipping problem. Portuguese and Spanish wine producers in the 17th and 18th centuries discovered that fortifying wine with spirit helped it survive long ocean voyages to England in the colonies without spoiling, the same basic instinct that drove Dutch merchants to concentrate Shiraz wine into Brandewijn in the first place. Nearly every bottle of port wine sitting on a shelf today exists because of that same underlying logic. Alcohol as a preservative for a fragile product crossing an ocean.
And in a genuinely strange full-circle twist, brandy has returned, in a sense, to its medieval roots. Small, ongoing scientific interest in the antimicrobial properties of high-proof spirits has echoed, almost exactly, the reasoning medieval physicians used 800 years ago when they first started distilling wine and calling the result the water of life, even though nobody today is seriously prescribing cognac as frontline medicine. It is a strange thought to sit with. The same basic liquid that a 12th century monk at Salerno believed might hold back death itself is the liquid a modern bartender pours into a glass, warms slightly in cupped hands, and calls dessert. It was there, in the laboratories of the Islamic Golden Age, born from scholars chasing the pure essence of matter. It was there, in medieval monasteries, distilled by monks who believed they had found a cure for death itself. It was there on Dutch merchant ships, invented purely to dodge shipping costs and French export taxes. It was there on the West African coast, traded as currency in one of history's greatest crimes. It was there in the frozen vineyards of 1709, and there again a century and a half later, when an invisible insect nearly wiped the entire industry off the map, saved in the end by grafting French vines onto the roots of the very American plants that had caused the disaster in the first place. It was there in Prohibition-era speakeasies, and there again in hip-hop lyrics a century later. It has been sipped by kings, smuggled by bootleggers, poured into Christmas pudding, and splashed into a saucepan to deglaze somebody's Tuesday night dinner. It has been medicine and poison, currency and craft, a farmer's tax dodge and a rapper's status symbol, sometimes within the very same century. It has aged quietly in dark cellars in Western France, while wars, revolutions, and famines raged outside, patient in a way almost nothing else in this story managed to be. None of that was the plan. Nobody in 1600s Holland set out to create a luxury good. They set out to move heavy, taxed, spoilable wine across the ocean a little more cheaply. And they accidentally invented one of the most prestigious spirits categories in the world by simply forgetting to add the water back. Not bad for burnt wine. If any part of this surprised you, the frost, the phylloxera, the slave trade connection, or the fact that American vine roots are hiding underneath nearly every glass of cognac in the world, let me know in the comments which detail caught you off guard. And if you want more stories like this, the strange, accidental, often uncomfortable true histories behind the everyday things in your kitchen and your liquor cabinet, do me a favor and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.